All right, what's cracking, guys? So welcome to today's episode. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, make sure you smash the subscribe button and pay it forward by sharing with a friend if you think they would enjoy it, or if they're just weak and not that jacked. So today I'm going to be talking with Nick Shaw, who is co-owner of Renaissance Periodization, and we're going to be talking about what it takes to be successful. So first off, thanks so much for jumping on, Nick. It's great to have you here. Could you just give yourself a little bit of an introduction to maybe some of the people who aren't familiar with you?
Yeah, totally. Well, thanks for having me on first. Really appreciate it. Yeah, so I started RP about a decade ago with Dr. Mike Israel. Most people are familiar with him in the strength space. And so we started about a decade ago. We both went to school at University of Michigan together. From there, we were personal trainers in New York City for about a year or so. He went back to get his PhD. I stayed in the city, was training people. Kind of pretty quickly realized I didn't want to spend my entire life on my feet, especially in New York City, running around everywhere. And I was like, man, there's probably got to be a slightly better way. And at the time, Dr. Michael was training some folks online and was like, hey, you should help me out. And this was 2011, 2012. So online coaching wasn't as big of a thing as it is now. I mean, shoot, everyone today is an online coach, but that wasn't the case about a decade ago. So that was pretty cool. And that's how we got started at RP. Went from there into, digital products and into the templates and later into the app. And here we are, a decade later, still going strong. We still love fitness.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, especially when you think of, like you said, how prevalent it is right now to think of a time where that wasn't something that was just a common kind of paradigm is pretty odd. So recently, or I don't know if that was too recently, fairly recently, you wrote a book called Fit for Success. I actually just reread it yesterday because I wanted to kind of have everything fresh in my head. Um,
Sweet.
yeah, fantastic book. Really enjoyed it. I liked a lot of the things you talked about. And so I'm sure that we're going to dive into a handful of things you discussed here. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about, I guess, was you mentioned in your kind of pyramid or hierarchy of success, work ethic is being one of the base or more foundational things that you've seen. And I just wanted to see if you would talk about like overcoming potential deficits, whether it's environmental or personal deficits, through just hard work and effort and things like that, and just kind of elaborate a little bit more on your perspective on those things.
Totally, yeah. So the reason that work ethic forms the base of the success pyramid. So at RP, we're really well known for basically making pyramids, right? So we have one when it comes to training, we have one when it comes to recovery, when it comes to nutrition. And so I took that same idea and made one of like, hey, what does it really take for people to be successful? And I don't just mean fitness. This can apply to life, overcoming obstacles, personal finances, etc. But really, at the end of the day, what it comes down to is you can have all the best ideas in the world, but if you don't ever act on them, then it really means nothing. And so that's kind of like the key secret sauce there is you actually have to do the work. So that sucks when it comes to fitness because there's no secret hack, there's no special way to just get really jacked or really strong because you actually have to go in and do the work and you can't really get around that. And so I think that's, again, from my point of view, it's kind of this really cool thing because, well, that can mean if you don't have the best genetics in the world, well, if you do the things that most people aren't willing to do, you can probably, I'm not saying you can always beat the people that might be more blessed or whatever, but you can certainly kind of keep up with them. And that was something I learned in high school because I was definitely not a good athlete. I was a really crappy kind of distance runner, but I just did what basically everyone else on my team wasn't willing to do. And I went from like the worst runner my freshman year to pretty good my sophomore year. And, by the time it was really just this light bulb moment for me in high school. I was like, yeah, I think there's something to this hard work thing and just kind of always applied that. I mean, you know this as well, just being in the fitness space, but that's the cool part. You can you can start at a 120-pound little skinny kid in junior high or high school. And man, if you just keep applying that and keep working hard and just be 200 plus pounds, deadlifting 600 pounds, a decade later, I mean, that's like, how cool is that?
Yeah, well, that's actually kind of literally my story as well. Because when I my last fight was in 2010, 2011, something like that, and I was fighting at 165, and I was a legitimate 165. pound guy. And so at 183 centimeters, like I was just skin and bones basically. And I mean, if you told me that I'd be 280 and a power lifter, I'd be like, get the fuck out of here. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
it's
no
really
way.
hard to put yourself into those positions. But then exactly like you said, you start working, you start gaining momentum, you start, seeing what else is possible. And it's kind of wild. You mentioned a couple things there that I really liked. And just one of the things was, as simple as it is, like you tell anyone, hey, you just need to work a little harder, and everyone knows this. It's one of those things that, like, intuitively everyone just knows, but so few people actually act on it. You know what I mean? And it's so wild how little value people put into that. Like even with training, when sometimes you'll hear, oh man, well, like I'm dieting, I'm doing all this stuff, and I'm just not getting the results. And it's like, okay, well, yes, you went from doing nothing to doing something, but that something hasn't reached critical mass yet. And so it's not necessarily enough to actually start turning over results. And, one thing that there's this guy I've followed for a long time, Grant Cardone,
Mhm.
and he talks about how people, one of the main reasons why people fail is they dramatically underestimate the time it's going to take to accomplish something and the effort that's required as well.
Oh
And
yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's kind of basically exactly what you were just saying. Um, I also wanted to, I guess, get your feedback on one thing is like translating skills from one area to another. Because, maybe most people aren't good at, let's say, lifting weights or business, but they usually have something that they're really good at, whether it's, they're a fast learner or I don't know, they're great at chess. And so usually there's some sort of like skill set that can translate over to help them be successful in other areas. But I think that a lot of people really struggle, including myself, to take what made them successful in that area and apply it in other contexts. So can you just kind of talk a little bit about that and how someone might actually go about, sort of organizing that process?
Sure. So let's just take fitness as an example, because we're talking to fitness folks. How do you become good at lifting? And that's, a rhetorical question. We kind of we all, hopefully all know the answer to that more or less. Well, like you did a little bit today, and then, through progressive overload and just sticking to the really just boring, unsexy basics for months and years over time, you're able to go from kind of where you're at now to a place much greater in the future. And well, what if we apply that same principle, that same line of thinking to something like, oh, I don't know, personal finances? Well, how do wealthy people become wealthy that are not just inherited wealth, which is actually a pretty small number of people that become, self-made millionaires, whatever. A lot of people like to think that it's all just, given to them. That's actually not the case. But
I
so
think
how do
it's
you
less
do
than
that?
20%.
Yeah, it's the vast majority of people, it's self-made. And so, well, how do you do that? All right, well, let's just say you, I don't know, apply the same unsexy basics, but consistently over time. So, what does that look like maybe in finances? Well, what's super unsexy? Just is not popular. Living below your means, not spending a ton of money, saving and investing. Now, well, what about investing? So, is it like the really super popular, trendy stuff? Well, that would be like doing that bullshit, stupid ass belly wraps or something like that. Well, hopefully you're not doing that, for the love of God. You know that doesn't work in fitness. Why would you think it works in something like personal finances? So, well, maybe you keep that same idea and approach and you apply it to a different area. The unsexy basics, super low cost like index funds, the most boring thing in the world. But then you sit out there and read all the different stuff and it's like, oh, well, you just kind of let time and compound interest work for itself. Gee whiz, that sounds a hell of a lot like what it takes to be successful in fitness, right? You just keep going. Now you don't get quite the compound effects in fitness. That would be pretty cool if you did, right? You'd be like, oh yeah, I just deadlifted like 3,840 pounds. Right? That's pretty sweet, but it doesn't work that way. But again, it does have a lot of carryover, and it is honestly, at the end of the day, I think it boils down to a couple things. People aren't willing to kind of do the slight edge things, and that's actually a really good book.
Oh, I love that book.
Dude, I'm rereading it right now. I think it's actually probably the best book I've ever read.
Yeah,
I feel
that's definitely on my top three for sure.
yeah, yeah. I'm rereading it right now. I just read about 50 pages this morning. But most people just aren't willing. One, again, so like, what does it take one day to be successful versus the next? Well, it's probably something so simple and easy that like it's really easy to overlook. So you might just not do it, right? Because in fitness, that's, oh, well, maybe you just skip your workout and, you just eat one or two meals that are, a little bit overboard. Well, you keep doing that day after day after day. And where does that lead you? It starts to lead you in a really poor direction. So you kind of get the negative compound effect versus the positive compound effect. It's the same when it comes to saving, right? It's not sexy to save $10 a day, let's call it. But at the end of a week, you've got $50. And at the end of a month, you've got a couple $100. All of a sudden, you apply that for 10 years. Well, like, you're probably worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But it seems so easy to do. So a lot of people skip it. And here's the other thing, it's just so damn boring and so slow that people fall off. Because if you have something that you're naturally a little bit gifted at, you've probably been doing that more because you're good at it and it's fun. And then if you try to do something you're not so good at, and I can speak very much to this in the sport of jujitsu, I've been training maybe like a year. Dude, I suck at it. I had never grappled. I had never done any combat sports my entire life. But I was like, you know what? I want my kids to do this. So I'm like, I'm gonna try to lead by example. And I wasn't good at it. It did not come natural to me. It still does not come natural to me. They're like, hey, do this. I'm like, what? I'm like, I don't even know what you're trying to do here. But again, like, it would have just been easy for me to stick with kind of what I'm quote unquote good at, just like lifting and things like that. But again, you just have to apply that same line of thinking to other areas, and you just have to be patient with the process. And if you can do that, yeah, you're probably going to be pretty successful in the long run.
Yeah, and it's so funny because even from a coaching standpoint, right? Like I found that for myself, anyways, I constantly have to have conversations with a lot of my athletes where sometimes they'll be struggling and they'll kind of be frustrated and be like, kind of hitting a plateau, or they're just maybe, working really long hours and their environment isn't necessarily that conducive to the most productive progress that they've seen. And so their rate of progress is slowed down and it becomes a little bit more difficult and they're all frustrated. And they're like, man, I don't feel like I'm going anywhere. And it's like, okay, let's zoom out a little bit. Over the last 3 years, how much stronger have you gotten? And they're like, oh, well, I'm squatting 20 kilos over my previous 1 rep max for 5 reps with 3 reps in the tank. It's like, okay, so you've been stronger, yes? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, have you had difficulties up until this point? Like, yes. I'm like, did you get through them? Yes. Are you still stronger? Yes. Okay, cool. So we can probably extrapolate that out and assume that you're going to continue getting stronger if you just don't quit, right?
Yeah.
And as it's so goddamn obvious, but when I'm in it, man, I need to have that same conversation with someone else,
Oh,
right? it's
yeah.
it's real hard it's real hard to disassociate. um
It is. Well,
yeah,
so real quick on that note, it's so obvious to see these things in other people. And I think that's, part of why I think a lot of coaches also hire their own coaches, because you can write a hell of a lot of excuses for yourself if you're doing your own programming. But like if someone else is doing it, you're like, oh man. So I love that part because you get a little bit detached from it. So, if I'm coaching you or you're coaching me, and I'm like, hey, I just really don't want to do this, you're gonna be like, shut up, just do it. And I'm like, yes, fine, yes, I know that. Man, just go and do it. So it's definitely just that kind of detached, like you said, you kind of just take this step back and then you can kind of very clearly see what's going on. But when you're in the middle of it, man, it's frustrating. It's really tough to overcome, that's for sure.
yeah, and I think that is where having a good coach or mentor or someone can be so important, because I mean, I maybe about 4 months ago or something like that, I hired my very first coach. And a lot of the stuff we're doing isn't that different from what I was doing, you know but I have never seen better results in my life. And it's like, okay, well, why? Well, probably because my adherence is exponentially better when I'm working with someone else than when I have to answer to myself, because it's like, I want to go with my friends, and they're having a night out, and I'm kind of like, oh man, I'd like to have some food when we eat out. And before I'd be like, oh yeah, fuck it, it's not that big of a deal, it's just one day. But
Yeah,
now
yeah.
I'm like, nah, my guy's gonna see this and he's gonna see my macros and he's gonna be pissed. And so it's like I can't let him down. And so even just that little extra bit makes such a big difference. That 1 degree of separation can be so important. I wanted to get your perspective on locus of control as well, because that's
Yeah.
something I know you talked about in your book, and I think that's something that not a lot of people really acknowledge as much as I think maybe they should. So can you just kind of first off discuss, like, first off, what is locus of control, and then how might you actually implement some of these concepts into your own life?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea, but that exact term, I actually was kind of surprised, like when I started writing about it. A lot of people are like, well, what do you mean locus of control? Or do you mean focus? A lot of people thought I had a typo. And I'm like, well, I'm not that dumb to have a typo that obvious in my book. But it means what it boils down to at the end of the day is you focus on the things that you actually have control over. So why would I be upset that it's raining outside? I don't know. That doesn't make any sense, right? If you think about it logically, you're like, "Oh, man, I can't control the weather. So why am I going to be upset about that? Okay, I can't do anything about it. So it just kind of is what it is. It's kind of like the Stoic philosophy. That's a cool thing. You look back, there's people that knew all this stuff thousands of years ago. That's what I kind of find pretty fascinating about it too. So you're all right. I can't control the weather. Can't do anything about it. All right, what can I control now? So if you're only focused on kind of things you don't have any control over, like you get really stressed out if it rains, or my favorite example of myself is, if I'm watching a football game and I get upset because the team's not doing well. It's like, well, gee whiz, idiot. I'm not there. I'm not competing. I'm not on the field. Like, why am I upset? I can't do anything about it. That's more of an external locus of control because you don't have any say over it. And nothing that you do is going to matter. Whereas on the flip side, internal locus of control, you essentially just know that the things you do and things you think are ultimately going to control your destiny. And if we use a rain example, well, you might wear rain boots or a rain jacket or an umbrella. Or maybe if you know you have to drive somewhere and it's raining out and traffic's going to be bad, well, gee, you can't control either of those. So what do? Well, you leave earlier. And so the cool part about this is, so actually just recently did the RP Virtual Summit, and I did a presentation, and locus of control was one of the things I talked about. And a lot of people are like, well, how do you kind of help people cultivate this? And I think that's a really good question. And I thought about it a lot. And then I watched Dr. Melissa Davis, a colleague of mine, present on building habits. And she said something to the effect of, you can't change something unless you're aware of it. So part of it is you have to develop the self-awareness around it. And like for me, I mean, I've literally been thinking about this idea for every single day for the last couple of years. So it's just like kind of so obvious to me because it's just always in my head. It's always something that I'm thinking about. I'm sure we can all relate to that too when it comes to fitness. You see someone that's eating a plate of spaghetti and gummy bears or something like that. Like some shit that, like, I don't know, a normal person might eat. And you're like, what? What in the world is that? That doesn't make any sense. Like, where's your protein? You're over consuming carbs by like a mile. So again, because that's all we think about, right? That's just what we think about every single day is, hey, macros and nutrition and training and all that. Well, for me, it just kind of applies. And, I think part of the reason that it is a really hard concept to overcome is because you take a look around on something like social media. What do you see? You kind of see this highlight reel of everyone, and you start to think and question yourself. And you're like, man, that person has it so much better than I do, or that person's doing something, or, Daniel, he's 280 pounds, he's deadlifting like way more than I can. You're like, man, I must suck. Well, like, I can't control what you're doing, but now then I have to kind of take a step back and look like, all right, well, let's not worry too much about what other people are doing, but what can I start doing? How can I improve myself? And when you get that, when you really focus on the things you actually do have control over, even if it's really small, simple stuff, kind of goes back to that whole, I think we just talked about this earlier, of just confidence. Little by little, you just take one step in the right direction, and sooner or later, you kind of get that momentum, and the ball just starts rolling a little bit easier for you.
Yeah, 100%. And just to kind of even build on what you were saying as well, I think when you start to identify some of those areas that you do have control over, it kind of feeds into the self-determination theory, right? Where it gives you that sense of autonomy. And a lot of the times, right now, COVID, we've got this big crisis. People are losing their jobs. There's a lot of instability, both financial, relationally, like everything. And I think a lot of people are kind of looking for some sort of semblance of control. And this is obviously sort of like an extreme version of that. But at the end of the day, I think a lot of people, obviously myself included, kind of go through a lot of that stuff when you have some sort of setback, if you have an injury, if, let's say you lose your job, or I don't know, whatever it might be. And just finding ways to be able to exert yourself into the situation and say, you know what, okay, I can't do this or this, but I mean, I can apply for 50 jobs every single day until I get a job.
Yeah.
And I mean, sure, that's not necessarily what you want to do, but if you apply for 50 jobs a day, I guarantee you're going to have like at least 15 offers by the end of the week, you know? So you can just go overboard and make sure that you're always covered. Another thing, because I think you brought up a really, really great point as far as like just focusing on what you can control, is that's something that I talk to my athletes quite a bit about as well. Like during competition, um, sometimes we'll be like, oh, well, what's the other person squatting? What's the, like if they're going head to head, it's like, it doesn't matter. Like you're going out here to do your best. And if
Yeah.
your best isn't good enough to beat him, then it's not good enough to beat him. And if it is, then it is. But there's no point, at least in my mind, and I know a lot of people disagree with that, but that's just how I feel. I'm like, there is no point in paying attention to what someone else can do. You're not going to automatically be able to lift 30 more pounds because you see someone else doing it. It's like either you got it or you don't, you know, and we're already trying to push you to, damn near your maximum anyway. So I don't know. That's just sort of my opinion on that.
Yeah, no, well, it has a lot of truth to it because here's the thing: when you really start like stressing and worrying too much about what other people do, well, one, it's going to get in your head. Now, maybe some people use it as a benefit. Absolutely, I'm not going to say no one gets a benefit from that, but you really just start to kind of lose hope when you don't really have control over the situation. Because you're like, well, why bother? Why bother if like I can't have any control over it? And that's the slippery slope. And you mentioned COVID. I think that's a perfect example because it's so easy to fall into that. You know, if we go back in time a year and a half to March 2020 when the pandemic first hit, I think you saw a lot of people start heading in different directions. There were the people that like, oh, this is terrible. Oh, it's me. Oh, I'm not gonna say it wasn't bad because listen, I had a whole hell of a lot of stuff going on, my own personal life to deal with that sucked, but I refuse to kind of play that victim role and go into that negative downward spiral that can come when you don't have hope. But the great thing about internal locus of control is when you know that what you do matters, and it doesn't have to be a big thing. Just take a single step, even if it's a tiny step, in the right direction to get the ball rolling. When you do that, it gives you hope. What does hope give you? Well, hope helps get you through all the rough times up there. That's for sure.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And actually, it's funny that you brought that up because I remember quite vividly when COVID first started happening and no one knew what the fuck was going on.
Yeah.
I remember seeing all of these posts about if all you can do is just get out of bed today, you should be proud. And for me, I was like, this is dangerous. It's really dangerous because it's like, is everything that's happening unfair? Yes. Is it shitty? Yes. Are people's lives being destroyed? Yes. But is the solution really to say like, hey, you know what, just give up, it's okay, and like placate people? I'm obviously not there to judge for other people, and some people maybe just, yeah, be at the absolute end of their rope. But I think in most instances, the people who came out on top were the ones who were like, man, this is brutal. I hope it doesn't, let's try and make this end in a better situation than when it started. Right. And for me, actually, like when the pandemic first started, that's when I started submitting articles for the first time. And that's when I first got published. That's when I first started my podcast. That's when I got, and then I got picked up by Kabuki Strength. And so now I work with them. And all of that happened just over the course of the pandemic because I was like, man, I need to do something to make sure I'm productive in this time.
Yeah.
Because like I was just sitting at home because I worked from home, obviously. And it was just like, it was brutal. I was bored. I was down. It was just like, man, this sucks. And the thing is, it's like, I think everyone's right. When they're like, oh man, I lost my job or I broke up, it's like, yeah, that sucks. It's not fair. It's terrible. And some people have way worse shit to happen than obviously what happened to me. But at the end of the day, it's like, I think there is some sort of something comforting about being like, okay, I'm going to come out of this at least a little bit better than when I went in.
Yeah, for me, I always think about it this way, and let me know if you think this is on the right track, if you think like this too. But is it okay to feel down and have stress and anxiety and just be pessimistic every now and then? Absolutely, it absolutely is. But where does that get you? What does that do for you? I understand you should absolutely go through some of those emotions, and that's just kind of part of life. You're going to have to deal with some of that stuff, and it's okay to grieve and be sad, etc., etc. But then what? Like, what do you do then? What's after that? Do you just continue that? Is it just a perpetual pity party? Is it you just, start to give up? Well, I don't know. I don't think that's the right course of action because that's going to lead to nowhere good. And it very quickly can lead to a negative downward spiral. And then all of a sudden, you have this just pessimistic view on the entire world. And one seemingly small thing happens and it just kind of like sets you off over the edge. And you're just like, oh, this is terrible. Like life sucks. Everything's awful. It's like, okay, well, maybe, but what would happen? I'm not saying this is easy. Here's the thing, it's not easy. It's a simple concept, but it's not easy to do because we're human. We have emotions. We're not robots. But what would happen if you just started taking like one little step in the right direction? Use some examples here. What if it's, hey, life sucks. I just lost my job, all that. But you know what? Hey, I'm still here. I'm grateful to still be here, right? Because COVID saw some really bad stuff happen. What about something like that? Well, maybe it's like 0.01% for that day, but maybe it just moves you a little bit, right? Like that's just the difference, right? If you just kind of change that mindset a little bit, it's just these little things, little by little adds up, and you just start moving in that other direction rather than the negative downward spiral. For me, I think that's just the big thing that I try to think about a lot.
Yeah, no, I honestly couldn't agree more because exactly like you said, it's like, is all that stuff valid? Yeah, probably. But at the end of the day, it doesn't actually change the situation. If you lost a loved one, if you lost your job, if you lost, your financial security, your house, whatever, might have happened, you're still in the same situation. And so at some point there needs to be like some sort of owner's responsibility to be like, hey, you know what? No one's going to get me out of this position than me. And like you said, it doesn't have to be anything crazy, right? Like you don't have to be like, okay, I'm going to start a company and I'm going to do this and this and this. And it's like, sometimes I think there's this idea that you have to go from 0 to 100. And it's like, no one goes from 0 to 100. You go from 0 to 1, right? 0 to like, okay, I'm going to apply for a job. Or what would it be like to own my own company? Or, you know what I mean? Just even getting an idea and like, exactly like you said. So yeah, no, I couldn't agree more with everything you're saying right there.
Or 0 to like 0.1 or
Sure.
0.5.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like sometimes 0 to 1 for sure. But no, and I'm just
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
just a little silly. But yeah, that's right. It's like 0 to 100 doesn't exist. It's not how it works. And
Yeah.
again, I think social media kind of feeds into that a little bit with folks, and you start to think that maybe it does work like that, but it doesn't. It doesn't, folks. It doesn't. I hate to bring that bad news to you, but that's how it works.
Yeah, so I wanted to get your opinion on like sort of timelines for success because this is something I know a lot of people struggle with as well, especially with social media. They'll look at someone and be like, "Oh, well, I've been powerlifting for, 2 years and I'm here. This guy's been powerlifting for 6 months and he's like breaking the junior national record." Or with businesses, like they'll constantly reference Jeff Bezos or someone else. And it's like, okay, so you're comparing yourself to one of the most successful people to ever exist. You think that's a fair comparison? And but at the same time, we do need to be able to accurately evaluate our progress to see, do we need to pivot? Do we need to, adjust anything? Or are we making very good progress based on, what you would normally expect? So how do you have a good process for doing that?
Well, yes and no. I think 'cause I don't know exactly how long things are going to take. So, for example, someone might say, "Hey, where's RP going to be in 3 years from now, 5 years from now?" I don't know. I mean, I have kind of, we have a rough roadmap in our head, of course. Yeah, absolutely. But we're just going to apply the same principles that we do for anything else. Like we're just going to keep tweaking things. We're going to learn from feedback. We're just going to keep getting a little bit better. We'll keep making mistakes. We'll keep failing. We'll keep, doing things wrong here and there. Like that's what happens. You just learn from it. You get a little bit better, and you just keep moving forward. It's stuff like that. It's kind of the mastery mindset where you don't really have like a set destination or outcome. You just love the process. And for me, I think that's very much true when it comes to RP. It comes to personal finances. It comes to fitness. I don't know if I really have some ultimate goal where I want to be, when I'm 50 years old when it comes to fitness, but hopefully that means I'm just still training my ass off, and maybe my priorities will shift a little bit, and who knows, maybe I'll be running Ironmans then. I have no idea. But guess what? It's going to be something where I'm like pushing myself to the limits quite often and just trying to get better all the time. So really, I think the big takeaway is like if you have shorter time horizons, it usually leads to worse decisions being made. Whereas if you have a longer term time horizon, you start to think a little bit differently. So an example might be, maybe you're a fitness influencer online, and some BS company comes to you and they're like, hey, I'm going to give you a bunch of money to hawk my skinny diet tea, belly wrap, whatever. And you're like, oh, cool. I just want to be more wealthy than I was yesterday. Yes, I'm going to say yes to that. Of course. Yeah, give me my money. And then, like, you say that, well, now you've lost all credibility. Now, like, are people really coming to you because they trust you with like what you're going to recommend fitness wise or whatever? No, of course not. But what if you were like, the same company reaches out, but you have a longer term time horizon? You're like, I want to be someone that people come to and look up to in the fitness space, a year from now or a couple of years from now. That's just kind of my end goal. Whenever I get there, I get there. Well, you're going to tell those people to fuck right off. That's it, because you have a longer time horizon. And apply this to other things too. Well, gee whiz, when you're 17 years old, it might be really tempting to just juice to the gills because you want to step on, junior national bodybuilding stage. Oh, gee, is that the right answer for long term? Do you want to be around when you're like 40 or 50? Well, you start to make different decisions and you can prioritize things a little bit differently. So, generally speaking, the longer time horizons people have, the better decisions they're more likely to make.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, one area that I've definitely seen a lot of that in is in weight cutting, right? Like I'll see an athlete who clearly needs to gain like at least 20 pounds. And they'll be trying to cut weight to get to a lower weight class. It's like, okay, I mean, sure, that's going to benefit you in this competition, but what's your long-term goal? And are you going to keep doing that for every competition that it comes up? Like,
Yeah.
so I think, yeah, I think exactly what you said. When you sort of define your purpose and you're like, okay, this is what I want, this is the direction that I'm going, it makes it a little bit easier to say no to opportunities because, I mean, and I think this is one of the areas that I think people probably are more commonly confronted with is they're met with, let's say, 3 or 4 really fantastic opportunities, but only one of them actually aligns with ultimately what they want to do, right? So it's like, hey, do you want this job, this job, this job? All pay really well, all have great opportunities. You can make a fantastic case for accepting any one of them, but maybe your ultimate purpose is to, I don't know, have a little bit more mobility or something like that so you can travel. And only one offers you that. But the other ones offer you maybe more money or maybe more paid vacation time or whatever it is. And so it's like, they're all fantastic opportunities, but if you really, really are clear on what you want, I think that's the hard thing. Cause I mean, I made that mistake as well a handful of times previously where it's like, if you don't know exactly what you want, any opportunity is going to look like the right one, and that's
Yeah.
tough.
Yeah.
It's tough for
Well
sure.
said. Yeah.
Um, so actually, this is something that I think we might have a difference of opinion on, and so I'd love to hear your perspective on this. I mean, maybe we don't. I don't know, but personally, my opinion is more like you know how people will say you need to believe in yourself before you can do anything.
Mhm.
Like my personal opinion is that I agree with it, but I also don't agree with it. And here's the sort of like caveat. I personally don't place a whole lot of stock in my emotions. And I don't let that really determine a whole lot of, and that's for me, right? Because I have doubted myself. I have been terribly afraid. And, for every single fight, but I won every single fight by knockout. And I've done the same thing with all my lifts. I've been terribly afraid, very nervous, and yet I do it. And there have been times where I've been extremely confident and I miss. So I'm like, okay, these aren't necessarily reliable metrics to evaluate my level of preparedness or what's going to happen in the future. But then simultaneously, I think if you believe that they matter, then that has a meaningful impact on the outcome. So almost like you're placeboing yourself or noceboing yourself, I guess, in that
Yeah.
case. So my personal opinion is like, I don't believe that you have to believe in yourself. And in fact, I think it's a little bit unreasonable to think that you should believe in yourself to accomplish all these amazing things when you're just getting started. But at the same time, a lot of other people who are way more successful than me have kind of a counter position. So I don't know. I'd love your perspective on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there's some nuance involved for sure. I don't think it's like you must do this or you must do that. So a couple things. Uh, my probably biggest counterpoint to that would be, and again, I think we probably mostly align, just a couple small things in there. My main thing would be, so all right, if you're just getting started, but you don't really believe in yourself, that kind of, for me, it goes back to what we talked about earlier about having that hope. when you're like, well, I don't know. I think a lot of people would then just not even try. So for me, that's where that comes down from. And then, like, do I think I'm going
Sure,
to be the
that's a good point. I should replace lack of belief with maybe doubt.
okay, sure, yeah, yeah.
Doubt, uncertainty, something like that. Yeah, because you're right. I do agree with that.
So I 100% agree with you that we need to be more logical and rational versus more emotional. And that's something, again, just goes back to, working on mindfulness training. I know it sounds a little frou-frou, and I don't know how many, power lifters are out there doing that. I'm not saying you got to do yoga and, become a Buddhist monk or anything like that, but it just, the more you start to focus and be aware of these things, boy, stuff can happen, and you kind of just don't react. You're like, okay, well, what should I do next? So I'm with you there 100%, because if you're totally ruled by emotion, you're just not going to make good decisions. Like, sorry to say that. Are there maybe sometimes where emotions are beneficial? Sure. I'm sure we could make up some examples, but yeah, no, like logic and reason should win out. At the end of the day, the vast majority of the time, they do not, with most people, which is unfortunate. So it's one of these things. There's definitely just nuance involved. I think you have to have some belief in yourself that, like, hey, I can do this. I don't know what that looks like necessarily. It's totally fine to have doubt in yourself. I mean, gee whiz, I doubt myself all the time, of course. Actually, just got a text from a buddy of mine. He sent me this YouTube video talking about kind of how, like, your inner self-critic, how you kind of deal with that. And essentially the video is like, well, you just kind of have to be mindful of it, be aware of it, that it's there, and then you just kind of have to ask why. Like, well, like, what's going on here? Like, just kind of be curious about it a little bit. And by the way, this guy is like a super successful individual, the special forces at the highest level, literally the highest level. And it's cool to hear his perspective on things, because I think, it goes back to, you have to be aware of it. You have to notice that, like, everyone has doubt. I don't care who you are, everyone's going to have all that. But it's like this. I feel like it's almost like this tug of war, because you have this self doubt all the time. But at the same time, if that self doubt just pulls you all the way to one side, and you don't have any self belief, then for me, it goes back to, I just don't know if that person's going to actually really go for it. So there's got to be that little, like, kind of dichotomy in there of how you balance those two.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I was chatting with Dr. Lisa Lewis. She's a psychologist and a coach. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but she's a really, really smart girl. And one of the things that she said that I really liked was, when you are having these doubts, when you're feeling negative affect or whatever it might be, she's like, just sit down and ask yourself, like, is this a fact or a feeling? I was like, oh shit, that's actually, like, I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
It's kind of like what you're saying right now, right? Is in the sense that, like, you might doubt something, but you're like, is it possible I could do it? Maybe. Okay, let's see.
Well, so one other thing too, and this, I was having this text conversation with a buddy of mine today, I was just mentioning, and I kind of phrase it like this, and this is the thing that I've kind of come to realize, and my spin on it. There's a book called Upside of Stress. Kelly McGonigal, she's a professor at Stanford, has a couple other really cool books too. One is actually all about, like, she's very, fitness, willpower oriented. But the book's called Upside of Stress. And for me, it was like, so let's take the nerves that you have before a fight or before a big lift. Well, you can probably phrase it one of two ways. Like, holy crap, I'm so scared. I don't know if I can do this. Like, why should I be feeling like this? I don't know. Maybe for some people, that's going to lead them to do well. Maybe for some others, it won't. But on the flip side, you can kind of phrase it to yourself. You can frame it in your head. It's like, guess what? I'm nervous. I'm nervous as shit. But it's a good thing, because it means that I care a whole lot. And if you go back to, let's say, a couple months before the competition, if you are nervous, oh, I bet you, if you're nervous, you're going to be training a hell of a lot more. You're going to be doing everything that you can. It goes back to the locus of control. You're doing everything that you can, because, well, how do you really kind of minimize anxiety and things like that? When you practice and you rehearse, and you just get more comfortable and you get more confidence. And when you have that, probably those nerves are going to go down a little bit. They won't vanish all the way, but I basically just flipped it back to my buddy, and I'm like, you know what? Yeah, our inner self critic. I'm thankful that I have it, because I know that it's going to keep pushing me to always want to do better. So, how do you kind of frame it to yourself? That's probably going to matter.
Yeah, no, 100%. And there was some research I read, this was many, many, many years ago, looking at stress as well. And it sort of runs parallel to a little bit about what you're saying. And what they were finding was that stress wasn't necessarily a big defining factor of like health. This was looking at health risk anyways. They specifically differentiated stress in this context anyways, being how it's interpreted by the individual,
Yeah.
not necessarily physiologically, but like psychologically. Like, is this a good stress or is it a bad stress? Is this going to make me stronger, more robust, or is it just overwhelming and kind of exceeding your allostatic threshold, I guess? And they found that the individuals, I can't remember exactly how they measured stress, but they had some sort of you know psychological questionnaire or something. I would assume, but anyways, one of the things they talked about was it didn't seem to matter how much stress an individual experienced. It was just about their perception of what that stress meant to them, and that was a greater determining factor of what actually happened to the individual versus the actual stress they're experiencing, which again I just kind of thought was pretty interesting.
So
um
sounds like research that went into this book. Is it very much along those same lines? Yeah, absolutely.
yeah, so you mentioned two books, The Slight Edge. I've never heard of The Upside of Stress before, or no, I've heard of it but I haven't read it, sorry. So I've got a note here. I'm going to put that one on my list. Do you have any of the other books that you recommend?
On a certain topic or anything, or just kind of overall?
Just sort of like what we're talking about, books that you've found to be really helpful in terms of like cultivating a productive mindset and just kind of getting you into headspace to I guess do exactly what we're talking about right now.
Sure. Yeah. Slight Edge is pretty much universal number one for me now. I'm even more convinced that as I reread it. So I'm like even making notes over my old notes. I'm like, oh my God, I just somehow wish that people could understand this idea. Um, Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. I think that it's great. And I listen to his podcast a lot. Uh, it's the ultimate example of internal locus of control. If you take ownership over things, like it doesn't matter because you're going to fix it. You have ownership over what's going on. You're going to figure out a way to fix it. Like, you're not going to blame other people. It's not going to be more external. It's like, nope, buck stops here. What needs to be done? Let's do it. Ties in perfectly, I think, with what we've been talking about.
Yeah, no, that's definitely one of my favorites as well. I really like how he ties that into leadership and just more of like a
Yeah.
management thing. Because that's something that I found when he speaks about his experience with coaching companies and stuff like that. That's I found the parallels to be very helpful. And you're like, oh wow, yeah, like this is so prevalent, but I mean it's bad leadership, right? And then you can kind of, I don't know, make some changes for yourself. But um, one that I kind of wanted to toss in was a book by Brian Tracy, actually, which was Eat That Frog. I don't know if you've heard of that,
Yeah, sure.
but
Yeah, I read it. Yeah.
yeah, I really like that one just because I know so many people struggle with just like executing. And it's kind of like the whole slight edge thing where you're talking about just taking that one step, just doing the one little thing. But I find a lot of the times people have all these things to do and none of them are really productive or moving them forward. And even I find myself like every couple of months looking at my actual like calendar and being like, okay, what is actually moving me forward and what's just cool stuff that I think is fun or engaging or that I like to do for maybe my social media content. And I find myself slashing stuff every couple of months because I'm just like, nope, doing it again, just filling my time up with shit that doesn't actually move the needle. So that's one that I'll toss in there as well. Um,
Yeah, yeah, it's good.
what what are your thoughts on like mentorship in terms of like do you have a mentor or is it more just kind of like a group of friends that you kind of associate with and collaborate with, or and also do you have any sort of ideas around like maybe finding a mentor for people who are looking for someone to help kind of guide them through either business or fitness or whatever? I mean, obviously it's fitness, you can kind of hire a coach, but I think with business it's a little bit more difficult because usually the only people offering like coaching are people who maybe were personal trainers for 3 weeks and then decided they become a coach because they had an online business and now they're coaching
Yeah.
other people to do shit that they didn't actually accomplish. And so you get a lot of people like that. So yeah, what are some of your perspectives on that?
Yeah. So in terms of fitness, I mean, I've been lucky. I met Dr. Mike in 2007. at University of Michigan when we were both undergrads. So in terms of like fitness, I've kind of always at least been on kind of the right track. I mean, we did a lot of stupid shit early on, of course. Don't get me wrong there, but he's actually, he's, I would say, probably my biggest mentor because he has a really good mindset. He's just always been like, well, we're focused on the long term. Like, so again, like he was, we always kind of generally agreed on most things, but it was just always cool. And a lot of the stuff that I've really learned the last couple of years, I kind of think back and I'm like, I feel like he was kind of doing some of this stuff beforehand. So Dr. Michael B. One, for sure, a really smart guy. Actually joined an entrepreneur group. Like most probably cities have them around, and they probably have some requirements to get in and whatnot. But I'm sure there's like other ones, depending on where someone is when it comes to business. Because you're right. Boy, I would be real skeptical if someone was like, hey, I want to hire a business coach. I'd beg, please be skeptical. Please go in thinking that they probably don't know what they're doing and get referrals or recommendations from folks that that you trust, or think kind of, all right, well, where am I at? Where do I want to be? Who's someone that's kind of there now? Maybe just like shoot them a message and, here's the part that I found pretty cool. Most people, if you reach out to them, some people are so big that they're never going to respond, but for the most part, most people are pretty chill. I had on the RP podcast, we had on James Clear. Like, he was really cool.
Shit, when was that? Was that a recent one? That must have been a recent one.
It was like June, probably came out in June.
Oh, okay, yeah. All right.
So he was on, and that's kind of, well, it was a funny story there. He sent a copy of his book like 3 years ago, and I sat there and didn't read it for 2 years or whatever. Meanwhile, it became like the best-selling book in America. Or like Amy Morin, who's written like a bunch of books, like 13 things that mentally strong people don't do. She's got a handful of those books. I just kind of randomly reached out and was like, hey, I really like your books. Would you like to come on the podcast? And she was like, absolutely. So, I think most people would be surprised. And like, I totally get it. Sometimes I'll look up to, famous people. I'm like, yeah, I can't reach out. And most of the time, what's the worst that can happen? They don't respond. That's the worst thing. No one's going to respond and be like, hey, fuck off. It's almost certainly not.
Just put you on blast on their social media. How dare this peasant reach out to me?
Exactly. That's not going to happen. Like, take your shot. Who knows? You'll probably be pleasantly surprised. So again, just be a little skeptical, work through referrals and stuff. Obviously, referrals are really good because then we know if someone else has worked with them that, they're probably not a total piece of crap. And do your research, because research is a funny term, I guess. So research, I'm making air quotes here.
Yeah, your due diligence.
Yeah. Your referrals, look up and talk to a few different people too. It's not like you find one, you have to go with that person right off the bat. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because even like when I was first starting the podcast, I just reached out to a couple people and I had zero expectations that I was going to get any good guests. But my podcast roster is actually pretty freaking insane. Yeah, and I didn't know any of these people initially, but they were just like, yeah, absolutely. They were like super, super friendly. And every now and then, like exactly like you said, there'd be someone who's just way too busy and can't get it done. But everyone's always been very, very polite, and it's been super cool. So yeah, I feel like people are a lot more receptive to that stuff than they probably would assume right off the bat.
Well, yeah. So, phrase it in the way of like, hey, come on and, promote your book, your latest book or whatever. Like, hey, I've got X number of people that listen, and, hey, these are some of my common questions I get. Like, hey, come on, chat about it. I think it's going to be helpful. And again, unless you're just super famous like The Rock or something, chances are you're going to be like, hey, cool. Like, I like talking about this stuff. That's awesome. Let's have a conversation. So
I actually messaged The Rock.
Hey, right on. How'd it go?
About the podcast. Oh, he hasn't got back to me. I doubt, seriously, he's got like, I don't know, 8 million followers, something like that. Seriously doubt he's actually even running his own account. But I was like, fuck it, I'll give it a shot. Worst case scenario, nothing happens. Nothing happened. No sweat.
Yeah, what was the worst case scenario? Literally nothing happened.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever. It took you a minute to write that DM. So it's like, geez, that's
Yeah. Plus, I only cried for like 3 days, so it wasn't even a big deal, right?
Yeah, well, that's
Um, so one thing as well that you kind of touched on in your book was you talked about the actual like hierarchy. So you actually gave a pyramid, and I guess we probably should have started out with this initially, but can you just kind of briefly go over what that hierarchy is?
Yeah, there's 7 things to it. Covered the foundation is work ethic. You move up one step and it's a positive mindset, and then a step after. I'm sorry. Number 2 is internal locus of control. Sorry. Number 3 is positive mindset, and then it goes into discipline, and then purpose, and then failure, and at the very tip you got recharge. And for me, under recharge would fall something like mindfulness. What are you eating? How are you recovering? Stuff like that, and because you can't just put your foot on the gas pedal all the time. You have to be smart enough to ease off the throttle here and there.
So it's almost like my interpretation of that, anyways, is almost like kind of Maslow's hierarchy of is it values or needs? I can't remember.
Needs.
Where it's like once you kind of satisfy this one, then you can move to the next one. You're always going to kind of be operating a little bit in all of them, but it's more, is it more like that, is what you're saying?
Yeah, for the most part, because you can have everything right, but if you're not actually doing the work, if you're not actually doing something, I don't think anything's going to result. I think the example in the book is it's like having no fuel for your car or for your rocket engine. You might have every calculation correct, but if you don't have the fuel in there, you're not going anywhere. The ultimate fitness example would be it's like getting every nutrient timing aspect right, but you're trying to lose weight and you're not controlling the calories. So I don't know, not going to lose a whole lot of fat. So.
Yeah. So what have been some of your, I guess, biggest insights over the last little while, even just kind of through the process of writing your book, where you really realize like, oh wow, these are some of the areas that maybe I don't want to necessarily say like deficient in, but maybe just some of the realizations that you had during that whole process of writing, where you're like, oh, okay, these things I see are really, really important to me now and have made a really significant impact.
So the 3 that stand out from those 7, and these are the 3 that I chose to do for my presentation at the RP Virtual Summit: internal locus of control, failure, and more or less discipline. I called it delayed gratification, but it falls under the same bucket as discipline. And if you can get those 3 right, I think you're going to be so well off that you're going to be greatly surprised. And of course, if you are disciplined, sort of by default, you have a strong work ethic because you're disciplined in doing the things that you need to do. So that would all go together. But those are the 3 that really stand out to me the most.
Awesome. So we're kind of coming up on that hour mark. Do you have any sort of final, I guess, closing thoughts or anything like that you think is really pertinent for a lot of people to hear or kind of consider?
I would say go buy a copy of The Slight Edge, read it, really internalize that. And if you can do it, you're going to be much better off in the long term. It seems like you're not doing anything, but I think at the end of the day, when we look back, and again, you kind of take that step back, you're detached, you kind of look down at things, you realize that that's actually kind of the secret to everything. You just keep doing a little bit, and you keep doing a little bit. It's not sexy. It's not going to get you from 0 to 100 overnight, but it's going to move the needle just a little bit. And if you can master that concept and not get bored or distracted or fall off and just completely quit, you just got to stay the course and you will be successful in the long term.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I definitely love that book. I've read it a handful of times, although it's been quite a few years since I've read it, so I probably should pick it back up again. um, where can people find you, and where can people find your book?
So Fit for Success is the name of the book. It's on Amazon. You can get Kindle copy for like $2.99. Price it cheap. So if anyone wants to get it, like, hey, it's not gonna break the bank. Or you can get a paperback for $14.95 on Amazon. Ship right to you. And hey, come check me out on Instagram at nick.shaw.rp. And of course, I think most people hopefully follow RP Strength online. That's our main handle. And a lot of cool content there, and we'd appreciate it if people come and check us out.
Awesome. So all that stuff's going to be linked up in the show notes, guys. Definitely make sure you go and check it out. And actually, if you are someone who prefers audiobooks, because I know a lot of people are listening to audiobooks these days, this is also available, if I'm not mistaken, on Audible. Is that right?
It is, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Awesome.
Reading your own book for multiple hours is a really interesting experience.
Oh, you narrate it yourself?
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
that's awesome. Yeah, yeah, I
Yeah,
bet. Hearing
that's
your own voice, eh?
well, that's right. Yeah. So did the Audible version, and also we did kind of like a little mini Q&A at the end of each chapter. So it's a little bit more than just reading the book. So hey, if you are into that, I would absolutely encourage people to do that. I like Audible books as well.
Awesome. Yeah. So all that stuff's going to be linked up in the show notes, guys. Definitely make sure you go give them a follow. And Nick, thanks so much for jumping on, man. I appreciate it. It's been a great chat.
Likewise. Thanks for having me on.